New America would like to welcome you to our virtual event. The program will begin momentarily. While we are waiting, I want to review a few housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded, and a recording will be posted to the New America events page within 48 hours after the event. Attendees will be in listen-only mode, and you will not be able to be seen or heard by your fellow attendees or panelists. Therefore, we encourage you to share your comments and questions in the Slido box located to the right of the video. Closed captioning is available by hovering over the video and clicking CC at the bottom of the video. You can purchase your copy of the book by clicking on Purchase the Book, which can be found at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. If you encounter any issues during the event, please contact events@newamerica.org. Thank you for joining us. We will begin momentarily.
Man, there has really been a upgrade to the infrastructure of the virtual space since I did my book talk with New America. We didn't have the voice of God or anything like that. So you get the nice treatment, Jonathan. How's it going, everybody? I am Clint Smith. I'm a 2020 Emerson Fellow and the author of How the Word is Passed. And welcome. Thank you for joining the New America Fellows Program and the Center for the Future of War for the discussion of Jonathan Katz, Gangsters of Capitalism, Smedley Butler, the Marines, and the Making and Breaking of America's Empire. Before we start, a few housekeeping notes. If you have questions during the event, please submit them through the Q&A function, and we will make sure to get to them in the second half of the event. And most importantly, copies of Gangsters of Capitalism is available for purchase through our book-selling partner, Solid State Books. You can find a link to buy the book on this page. Just click buy the book at the bottom. And I say this, and I'm gonna say this beginning, because sometimes in this virtual space, people can like click on it and they'll open a tab and they'll be like, oh, I'll get to it. And you've got 7,000 tabs on your computer, and then your computer crashes and you never get a chance to buy the book that you meant to. Do it right now, click on it, buy the book, buy 7 of them, buy them to stack on, under your computer for your Zooms, buy them for your coffee table, buy them to show that you are a thoughtful interrogator of the larger American imperial project, and in putting it in conversation with the world around us today. But most importantly, buy it because it's an excellent book. And I'm so excited to get into this conversation with Jonathan, who, if you are not familiar with, you should get familiar with. Jonathan Katz, Jonathan M. Katz, is a 2019 ASU Future of War Fellow at New America. He received the James Foley Medill Medal for Courage in journalism for his reporting from Haiti. His first book, The Big Truck That Went By, was shortlisted for the Penn John Kenneth Galbraith Award for nonfiction and won the Overseas Press Club's Cornelius Ryan Award, the J. Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Award, and the WOLA Duke Book Award for Human Rights in Latin America. His work appears in the New York Times, Foreign Policy, and elsewhere. Katz also received a fellowship from the Logan Nonfiction Program. He lives with his wife and daughter in Charlottesville, Virginia. Jonathan, how are you doing, man? How's the virtual book tour been so far?
It's been virtually great.
Virtually great. That's spot on. So, I mean, we're gonna hop right into it. These hours fly by. First of all, how did you decide to make Smedley Butler the sort of central character or protagonist around this book? Because this is, in many ways, this is a book about U.S. imperialism, and you could have taken a myriad of different approaches, but you kind of used a certain person, a certain character, someone who I wasn't familiar with, as our guide almost through the history of American imperialism. And I thought that was such a fascinating and effective strategy. And I'm curious if that's how you imagined it from the beginning, or did you kind of stumble on him, or were you going to write a biography of Smedley Butler and then just it morphed into something else? I'm curious of sort of the evolution of the process.
It kind of, well, first of all, by the way, thank you for doing this. This is terrific, and I've been very excited about putting our books in conversation, because you obviously wrote an incredible one. Yeah, so I mean, to a certain extent, and maybe I'm remembering it wrong, but this idea sort of like kind of almost popped out of my head, fully formed at once. I first encountered Smedley Butler while I was writing my first book, The Big Truck I had come across his name shortly after moving to Haiti. I think on Wikipedia, like in an article about the Banana Wars. I then, after the earthquake in 2010, I was writing The Big Truck, and I knew I wanted to sort of, go back into history and explain how things had gotten so precarious. And that required talking about the US occupation of Haiti. And Butler is a major character in that occupation. And for that book, I was looking, and maybe this is like partially an out of order answer to your question about the way that I think about my process. But like, even at that moment, I was thinking like, well, if I'm going to tell this story, to drive the narrative forward. And I didn't end up using any of the material that I collected on him. It was a very brief amount in the process of writing that book. But the thing about Butler that made him, I was sort of fascinated by both questions simultaneously. The question of, how has America's imperial past been remembered by the rest of the world, but is completely ignored and in many cases actively suppressed in memory hold in the United States? And who was Smedley Butler? Butler, I'm not just saying this like to sell books. I'm explaining like how I got into it. Like Butler is one of the most fascinating characters that I had ever encountered. He was everywhere. He was Zelig. He was in every U.S. Invasion, occupation, overseas war from 1898 until the eve of the Second World War. And then at the end of his life, he becomes a anti-war, anti-imperialist critic. And so part of it was just like, I was like, well, how did this person who was known literally as the devil in Haiti, how did he become this anti-war later in life? And then this sort of merged seamlessly, as I remember it. Maybe I'm misremembering, but I'm talking about memory from the beginning with this question of, and why is this person who was so famous back then, and why were these wars that were such a big deal back then, why are none of them talked about today? Which then created an opportunity to write a whole book about it. So that was that I'm sure there was maybe more conversations sort of at the beginning, but as I remember, the conversation with my agent was that I want to write this book about Smedley Butler, but I don't want it to be a biography of Smedley Butler. I want it to be a history of American imperialism, and then I want it to have this modern day component where I travel to the places and use sort of my skills as a foreign correspondent to talk about the ways in which that story is reverberates today, and that it was sort of a process of me trying to convince her and then trying to convince the publisher that this kind of cockamamie idea was a good one.
I mean, it's so interesting because, I mean, as you say, like he was everywhere. I mean, it's almost kind of like if I was going to write a screenplay, like making up a character, if I read this, I'd be like, okay, but like, was this person really at like every single imperial project that the United States engaged? I mean, he was in the Philippines, he was in Haiti, he was in China, he was in I think Mexico, he was in all these different places. And it just, I mean, it kind of, sometimes I think when you're writing nonfiction, the characters end up being better than the fictionalized versions that you would have come up with. And Smedley Butler to me seems like one of those characters who just serves as, again, this like really remarkable guide through so many of the sort of atrocities that the US has enacted or been a part of over the past several decades. And one of the other things you do, and you alluded to this, is not only is he serving as our guide, you're also serving as our guide, right? And there's a version of this book that could have been written from your office, right? That could have been written from the library, that could have taken so much of the incredible history and archives that you delved into, so many of the incredible primary source documents you spent time with, and written what still would have been a really great book. But I think what makes this book different and what takes it to the next level, and something that I really resonate with a lot, because it's very similar to how I did my book. We were talking before the webinar started about how there's a TikTok out there that has the book how to make an empire, or how to build an empire,
How to hide an empire. Yeah.
how to hide an empire, and then my book, How the Word is Passed. And it's like, if this book and this book had a baby together, it would be, and then they showed this book. And after reading the book, I was like, that's so funny, because we really had similar approaches, where it's this idea like, you have to go to the place where this history happened, because it gives you a different sense of that history, right? To be on the soil, to be in the buildings, to be with the people who are the descendants of those who experienced these atrocities. How did you come to decide that you wanted to truly travel across the world, to go to all of these different places, and why did that feel important to you?
So the first thing was that I was, so it was maybe a combination of motivations. One was, I'm a reporter, like it's what I do. I play historian, and I played historian for years while I was writing this book, because I spent a lot of time in the archives. But my wife, Dr. Claire Payton, like she's the historian, and so part of it was I can bring interpretive analyses. I can bring play with different frameworks, and I can sort of do some of the work that a historian does. But what I really do is I'm a reporter. Like I go places and I talk to people. So that was part of it. Another part was that, and this actually, as I'm remembering this, big shout out to New America, seriously, because like this book was really born out of sort of like my New America journey, like my New America process. The first time that I actually even said the words out loud, I think I'm going to do a book about Smedley Butler, was it's like an info session. And he's like, so what's your project? And I was like, what is my project? I was like, have you ever heard of this guy, Smedley Butler? Because it was like a name that had just, a concept that had been kicking around in my head for a while at that point. And it was in conversations, especially with a friend of mine through New America named Chris Leonard, who was a fellow and on board for a long time. We were talking about, so part of my concern was that even though this period really isn't that long ago, the period that Butler's fighting in, 1898 to 1940, it's really not that long ago. Like people are still alive who were alive during it. But I was worried that maybe it would feel remote, that some of the terms, some of the history would maybe feel a little stodgy. And I wanted to, make sure that didn't happen. And Chris actually put me on to a book by Tony Horwitz called Blue Latitudes, which was about the journeys of Captain Cook. And in that book, Tony Horwitz, I mean, this is also a thing that Tony Horwitz does in other places, but in that book in particular, Horwitz and a friend actually go to the islands in the South Pacific, in Australia, and I guess New Zealand, which is also an island in the South Pacific, where Cook went, and they and he intersperses, the entries from Cook's journals and historical research on that period with here I am in Tuvalu and I'm passing a billboard and it looks like this. And part of me, so part of the reason that I really wanted to do this was I was afraid that Butler, as many places as he had been, might end up being kind of character who would feel at a remove. Among other things, one of the only things that I knew about him at the beginning was he was a Quaker from Philadelphia, and he throughout his life wrote in his letters to his parents and his wife, he would use thee and thy, so even though he's writing letters like this in the 1930s, I was afraid that could feel a little out of date.
Yeah.
Imagine my surprise when I actually got into, and I was also worried that maybe there just wouldn't be that much material on what he actually was doing in these battles, what the battles looked like. I then, as I've gotten, I'm embarking on this research, and I'm sitting at the first place that I was doing archival research at Quantico, through Butler's letters, and they just and they're just, you know, wheeling out cart after cart after cart of his letters, and his letters are voluminous. I mean, they're just, he goes on and in detail, and he's like bearing his heart, and he's talking about his like toothaches and like what he had for breakfast and why it wasn't his preferred thing before he kills people. I mean, it's like, and I was like, and he's I mean, he's funny, he's complicated, he's terrible, like he, like, you know, his racism is like awful, and there's all these like parts of him, and I was like, and I didn't anticipate that at the beginning. And so, you know, the way in which he ends up sort of coming alive on the page in his own tellings and his own just sort of like characterfulness, and then, you know, since I was already, you know, fully committed to doing the modern day thing, I was like, you know, I had to, part of the writing process was trying to figure out, and this was also something that happened at New America in writing workshops, was trying to figure out, like, how do I balance like this just character who jumps off the page in the historical material and, you know, me going places. And that was a real negotiation about, you know, turning up the levels on this and turning them down on this, and trying to make it all work together. So the very short answer is that, like, it was at the beginning, I thought it was going to be born out of necessity. And then it ended up, I think, being just sort of something that added to what was already, as you note, a great narrative on its own.
Absolutely. Pivoting to the specific content of the book, one of the things that you talk about early in the book, and that was really illuminating for me. So for folks who don't know, my own book is a book about how the history of slavery is remembered or misremembered across the United States and to some extent abroad. And so I've been thinking, you know, a lot about the founding fathers, been thinking a lot about, you know, went to Monticello, went to Montpelier, went to Mount Vernon, think about what those places represent and what the sort of way that those people, those men and their ideas served as the foundation upon which not only American, obviously, domestic policy, but international policy would be built. And one of the things that you brought up was how Jefferson wrote a letter to Madison suggesting that they should annex Florida, Canada, and Cuba. And he says, "We should have such an empire for liberty as she has never surveyed since the creation." And I thought that was so illuminating. And I thought, and I'm thinking too about how for enslavers, they wanted to annex Cuba so that they would have a place to tip the balance of power so that they could have more control over Congress and the US government. And it really demonstrates this early relationship between slavery and between slavery and imperialism. And you talk about how so many of the people who were, you know, and this is the founding fathers, but even so many of the people who were the leaders of the Confederacy, or the former leaders of the Confederacy, and who were in charge of these sort of early in charge of the Confederacy and the early Jim Crow governments, were also the people who were going abroad and enacting the policies that were destabilizing these regions in the global South, often across the world. So can you talk a little bit about the relationship between sort of domestic manifestations of oppression through slavery, through Jim Crow, through indigenous genocide, whatever the case may be, and the sort of almost what feels like an outgrowth of those sensibilities in the way that some of those folks enacted and destabilized different regions across the world?
Yeah, no, those are all really good points. So as you note, like before the Civil War, one of the major drivers of the quest for expansion of the United States was slavery. It was to have more slave states, more land to expand slavery to, so there's slavery, capitalism, and expansionism were kind of the three legs of the stool. And so Cuba is initially looked at very hungrily by Jefferson Davis, as Secretary of War, he under Franklin Pierce, he is pushing to annex Cuba. Polk considers it, and at various points along the way, there are proposals to annex Cuba, to annex Santo Domingo, what becomes the Dominican Republic, and those are sort of rejected by sort of like white Americans' racism. Like it's like the scene in The Simpsons where it's like Mr. Burns is like disease profile, and all the diseases are trying to fit through the door at once, and Dr. Hibbert's like, if you remove one of them, they'll all come through, but they're all sort of keeping each other in check. It was kind of like that because yeah, I mean, like a successive president, Millard Fillmore came to this conclusion. James Polk came to this conclusion. They were like, well, we could annex Cuba, but they don't speak our language. They're Catholic, and the ratio of Black people to white people, of enslaved people to Europeans was such that they were afraid that it would have these sort of other effects on American life and on the American body politic that they didn't want. And what happens in the period of the book that I'm, that where the action is really set, so the book opens with the war against Spain in 1898, and Smedley Butler joining the Marines. He lies about his age, years old, and he joins the Marines to go fight in Cuba, and ends up at the first place the Americans conquer in Cuba, a little spot called Guantanamo Bay. And by that moment, so the Civil War has now happened, 3 decades before, and it is, but the Civil War just like suffuses this entire period in every respect. Both, Teddy Roosevelt and sort of the Jingos, the as they're known, like the expansionists, the imperialists, desire to sort of reclaim the glory of their father's generation missed out on. They'd grown up hearing tales of heroism in the Civil War, and they hadn't gotten to participate in it. And then also this sort of relationship between slavery and expansionism, because at this point, obviously, slavery has been outlawed in the United States. It's also been outlawed in Cuba, finally, over the course of 30 years of independence war by the Cubans against their Spanish colonizers. And because slavery is a dead letter in the United States, the people who were themselves former enslavers or the children of former enslavers are no longer in Cuba anymore. In Cuba to tip the balance of power in Congress, that's old hat. And so for them, the only thing that's retained is this other idea that they speak Spanish, they're Catholic, they're not white. Their idea, like Spanish categories of race are different than American categories of race. They don't subscribe to the one drop rule. So there are some people who don't consider themselves Black who would very much be Black in the United States. And they don't want it. And so you have guys like one of just the all-time great SOBs in American history, Ben Tillman, Pitchfork Ben Tillman, the one-eyed, not that having one eye makes him a bad person, but it just sort of adds the picture of this guy. The one-eyed, he was a Confederate. He enlisted in the Confederate Army, and he then becomes governor of South Carolina. He oversees a huge surge in lynchings, and he gives this passionate opposition to specifically the colonization of the Philippines on the floor of the Senate, where he says, incorporating the Philippines in the United States would bring in, and then he lists all the different categories and subcategories of non-white people that he's worried, and he's saying I don't want to be sitting next to the senator from Malay. Like that's not my vision of myself in America. And what ends up happening at this moment is the other thing that's happening. I draw on the work of Adrian Len Smith, who writes a great book called Freedom Struggles about this period, and others. this is this moment of reconciliation between sort of northern capital and southern capital, northern whites and southern whites. We're in the redemption. I mean, 1898 is also Plessy versus Ferguson. This is all. It's also the year of the Wilmington coup. So like all of these things are sort of happening at once, and basically white people in the North are like, well, let's find common ground with white people in the South at the expense of both non-white Black people in the United States and elsewhere. And this comes in, this is lived out on the ground in these wars. And there's also, in addition to Plessy, there's a series of Supreme Court cases known as the Insular case, which are still good law. They still govern life in Puerto Rico and Guam, etc., which say that just because the United States government runs your island, and just because the flag flies over your territorial house, does not mean that you have equal rights under the Constitution. And this is still in 2022. This is still the law that governs Puerto Rico. It's and Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands, etc. It's still the law. There's still the cases under which it is acceptable for us to have these fully owned colonies that do not have a vote for president and do not have representation on the floor of either house of Congress. And it's that compromise that ends up mollifying people like Pitchfork Ben Tillman, where he's like, well, if they're not going to have representation in Congress and they're not going to be able to vote for president and we're not going to have to give them equal rights, I guess that's cool with me.
Right. And that provided such helpful historical context for me, right? And it just really made the through line clear of the sort of colonial inequity, and the way that electoral agency has been stripped from these places that are ostensibly members of the sort of larger American project, and making it clear that, I mean, it's just so revealing, because it's, you see all these parallels between what's happening abroad and what's happening here, where they're like, oh, okay, well, if Black people can't vote, or if Black people don't have, can't run for office, or if Black people, if I don't have to sit next to them in the restaurant, or if I, and it's a similar sort of sensibilities that are animating the decisions about what the United States relationship to its colonial territories will be, depending on the nature of who they are. And I mean, I remember the part in your book about the Philippines where maybe it was like one of the generals or a politician, and they were using like anti-Black language about Filipinos, because they almost like didn't have the language, like anti-Asian or anti-Pacific Islander language to use, but they were like, well, they're brown. And so they just started using these anti-Black racial slurs to describe the Filipino folks. And again, it just makes that through line so clear. And this is tied to that. One of the things I didn't know, I just learned so many facts from your book, but like, I didn't know that the majority of people who built the Panama Canal, for example, were Black people who have been brought in from the West Indies. And one of the things you talk about is how the United States, both in Panama, but also more broadly, was like, Americans were exporting restaurants, and they were exporting, goods and services and certain things that came to these regions and like came to Panama, but they were also exporting American apartheid, right? Like, and I think you describe it as such. You were like, they were exporting the very racial hierarchy that existed in the United States, and then bringing it to Panama, and bringing it to places where, as you mentioned, the relationship of race, like what the sort of racial hierarchy looked different, right? Like race doesn't look the same in Panama as it does here. Race doesn't look the same in Brazil as it does here. Race doesn't look the same in Honduras as it does here. But part of what the U.S. did was impose its own conception of what it believed the racial hierarchy should be, and that animated what life in these places looked like, and really shifted, in some ways, the dynamics of race relations and racial dynamics in these places. I think I remember in the Panama chapter, you were talking about the struggle between, because these were Black West Indians brought in to Panama who spoke English, and then their relationship to the sort of the native and indigenous communities in Panama who spoke Spanish. That was contentious, but all of that was happening because white people from America were the ones who were bringing in English-speaking West Indians to, and the whole thing. It's like, it gave me such a more expansive understanding of how the U.S. destabilized these regions. Yeah,
exactly. And one of the things that I wanted to make sure, and it was a lens that I brought to the book, was that, it is not in no way, in almost in no areas of the book at all, is it just, the bad U.S. doing things to, blank slates. Like, these are people with agency themselves. They have their own histories and their own complexities, and race and racism is one of them. So yeah, in Panama, I spend a little bit of the book talking about and this was something that I would not have gotten just from reading. Maybe if I'd read enough, maybe, who knows, but like, I got it in a much more visceral way by going to Panama and spending time. The ways in which race in Panama is extremely complex, because not only do you have sort of the and in the period that I'm talking about, the Zonians, who are essentially like the white mostly white American colonizers who live in the Canal Zone, and then you also have you have the indigenous Panamanians, you have the Panamanians who are mestizo with mixes between European and indigenous and maybe some African ancestors. In Black, there's the fight between the Afrocoloniales, who are the descendants of the original or the older, I guess I should say, forced immigration of enslaved Africans by the Spanish, and then the West Indians, the Afro-Antilleanos, who are the descendants of the mostly Barbadans, St. Lucians, Grenadans, mostly from the Lesser Antilles, who the Americans brought in to dig the canal and die for us, for our benefit. And the way visceral sense of this was that I in Panama City, I went to there's a museum, and I talk about it in the book, called the Museo Afro-Antillano, the Afro-West Indian Museum of Panama, which contains a history that is not even reflected in the more well-visited museums of the Panama Canal that most tourists go to. And it just so happened, this is like this, and like there's a million moments like this in How the Word Is Passed as well. It's just like magic that happens, like you're just there. So I go to the museum. I introduce myself to a woman who is on duty that day. I'm the only person in the museum, and I'm like, I'm writing a book, and she's like, oh, well, we have a library, and I'll go down and I'll introduce you. And it's there that I encounter this bound volume of letters from the West Indian canal workers, almost all of which are written in English. Some of them are in Spanish. And I'm reading that. This table, covered in it's got a vinyl cover over the tablecloth, which is how you're really in in a Panamanian archive, somebody's house, basically. And the door opens and these women come in, and it's the meeting of the friends of the museum. And they're like, oh, well, you got to stay.
Yeah. And
so I'm in this meeting and I hang out, and it's this woman, Ines Seeley's birthday. It's, I think, her 80th birthday. And they sing her happy birthday, and they have cake and ice cream. and then I get to know her. And actually, I like there, there's so many things that I did that I don't have time for in the book. I actually end up spending like a day with Ines. She's awesome. And like she decides, like, she's like, there's a Smithsonian museum in Panama, like another remnant of American colonialism. It's like a wildlife center that like has like, it's like they have like frogs and like sort of like native animals, and it's really interesting. And she's like, we should go to that. And so like I'm like walking around with Ines, and she's looking at, and she's talking about her mother from St. Lucia and her father from Barbados, and them coming to Panama, and the double and triple racism that they experienced, both from the lighter skinned Panamanians and from the white Americans, and then also from the Afro-coloniales. And then I go to Cologne, which is, and I have lunch with Marcia Rodriguez, who is an Afro-colonial whose grandmother told her stories of the American invasion in which Smedley Butler took part in 1903. And it's just, and all of these are they're all wonderful women, and I would love to go back and hang out with them again. Honestly, they're awesome, especially, well, they're both cool. But it was just, it's exactly as you say. I mean, I talk about in the book the way that, the Americans who build the canal zone around, within which the West Indian workers, for the most part, do the actual building of the canal. And they bring Jim Crow, like they bring this system in which they divide the payroll. It's the gold and silver system, and you have essentially white and white American citizens are on the gold roll, and so they're paid at a higher rate, and they get better housing, they get better commissary, etc. They have their own separate entrances, and then you have the people on the silver roll who are almost entirely black. There are these interesting marginal cases where like white workers from Spain are like fighting, and they're trying to figure out like which roll do they go on. But and this was promoted by the Americans who are overseeing this as a mark of modernity. Like they sell this as a public health innovation, where they're like, we're bringing this great American innovation of segregation, which is going to somehow like keep people from getting malaria. It makes no sense. But like, but they build this as a mark of progress, and the fact that Panamanians had their own ideas about racial categorization and their own ways of living within what becomes the canal zone. Which, by the way, that's another thing that I didn't realize. I mean, I had heard about the building of the Panama Canal, but yes, was that this was an area that was depopulated. This was an area that people lived. Like there were tens of thousands of people who were evicted from their homes forcibly by the Americans for the purpose of building the canal. And one of the ways in which, Dr. Gorgas, one of the ways in which the Americans who are overseeing this ethnic cleansing, essentially, were just forced, total, population removal from the canal zone, is they're saying like, well, look how backward these people are. Like they weren't even segregated. Like they weren't even, like there were light-skinned and dark-skinned people like living next to each other. Like these people clearly don't know how to create a society. We're doing them a favor. And that was one of the ways in which Americans in that period told themselves that everything that they were doing was okay.
Man, it's always wild to think about the way that systems of white supremacy and oppressions more broadly attempt to justify themselves. I'm curious from your end. Also, I should say, as we are getting closer toward the end, we're about 2/3 through. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A function. I'll certainly incorporate your questions as we finish our conversation. So feel free to throw those in there. And if you have not purchased this book button, press it now. Do it now. Don't wait another minute. I'm curious for you. I mean, you went to all these different places. I mean, I just, again, this whole thing could just be me like going through my list of all the things that I learned from your book, like that U.S. imperialism in Honduras is related, and its relationship to banana exports. And then you talk about how that is one of the ways that the term banana republic came to exist. And it was one of those moments, I think I was like eating a Dole banana and I was like, oh snap, I was like, oh my, and then I was like, what am I doing?
You're eating a banana by the former Standard Fruit Company, on whose behalf Smedley Butler and the Marines intervened in Honduras in 1903.
And I have a question about that, but I'm going to do it closer toward the end. But one thing I'm just curious, just generally for you, like which place that you went was most, I don't know if the word's surprising, but like the place that has stayed with you the most. Maybe that was most surprising, that was most, that resonated the most, that devastated you the most, or that you learned the most. Like what is the, if you can pick, I know it's like picking your kids, it's hard, but like exactly. which one is the one that you are like, this I couldn't have written the book and not included this chapter?
So I want to stipulate first off that like Haiti, I lived in Haiti, for 3.5 years. A lot of my heart is still there. And Haiti is also the height of Smedley Butler's career. There's 2 chapters on Haiti. There's one on the Dominican Republic, which also deals with sort of the Dominican Republic's relationship with Haiti. I also lived in the Dominican Republic before I lived in Haiti. So there's the three Hispaniola chapters, sort of geographically, they're at the center of, they're literally the center of the book. And they really are sort of at the heart of how I came to this story, and the lens through which I view it. I mean, one of the, and I talk about him in the prologue to the book, and the prologue is broadly about Smedley Butler blowing the whistle on this fascist coup in the 1930s, which I could and often do find myself spending all day talking about. But I also am talking about, and I quote the great Haitian scholar Michel Rolfe-Trouillot, his book Silencing the Past, which was one of sort of my lodestars. And also, by the way, the epigraph to this book is a Haitian proverb, by Coublier, Pote Marsonger, the one who gives the blow. It was my translation, deals. I was trying to be a little bit cute with Gangsters of Capitalism. The one who deals the blow forgets. The one who bears the scar remembers. You know what? I'll just say that because I guess I just cleared myself into just making that my answer. I mean, I knew that I was going to have to go back to Haiti, to write this book. I went back at a period of extreme unrest. Haiti is now in yet another one. And I go with my dear friend Evan Sanon, who, if anybody here has read The Big Truck That Went By, will know Evans very well. He was my fixer and is my he's my friend, and he's it's the guy who I go through the earthquake with, and he's throughout The Big Truck, and he does make an extended cameo in the Haiti chapter of this book, because I go and I meet Evans in Cap Haitien in the north, and then we go into the mountains to look for the place where Smedley Butler won his second of 2 Medals of Honor in the massacre at Fort Riviere, and I go up this mountain looking for him and end up in a voodoo temple, etc. But Haiti, it will surprise nobody who knows me to say that, like, Haiti, it just comes through another part of the book that was ultimately sort of one of the first parts that I reported was on another trip to Haiti. I visit this industrial park that essentially the Clintons build in response to the earthquake, an industrial park which, unbeknownst to the Clintons and unbeknownst to the builders of the park, was a forced labor camp overseen by the Marines, including Smedley Butler, in which not only so Smedley Butler, among other things that he does in Haiti, a country founded famously in national revolt by enslaved people against their enslavers against France from 1791 to 1804. Smedley Butler then reimposes slavery in Haiti for the purpose of building roads for the occupation. And this is one of the forced labor camps. And at this forced labor camp, a great Haitian hero of the resistance against the Americans, Charlemagne Perrault, he's killed by the Marines. He is buried in this place where the Americans in the mid 2010s building a garment factory complex, and I go there and I meet I'm on a tour of this factory. I kind of escaped the tour, and then I speak Creole, so like I'm just asking people. I was like, where is Charlemagne Perrault? Where was he buried? Because I know his grave had been moved by that point. And I go there and I'm like, at this grave site, and I'm talking to a guy, I think his name is Anis Jean, and he's, and I'm explaining to him, in Creole, I'm writing this book about Charlemagne Perrault and this period in American history, because Americans don't know about it. And he becomes incredulous. He's like, I don't believe, I don't believe you. Like, how could Americans not know about this? Like, that's impossible. And so that was my answer was going to be the Philippines, but I ended up clearing myself into Haiti, as often happens.
But Haiti makes a lot of sense. Somebody's asking, and you alluded to this a little bit, but maybe you can go into some more detail. Is there anything that you left on the cutting room floor that you wish you had been able to include?
Oh man, so much. There's so many things. I actually have an op-ed coming out. I think this afternoon, and it contains a little bit of material from Haiti, from a joint attack by the Marines and the gendarmes, which were the client militia that Butler creates, which becomes the model for a whole lineage of client armies that include the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, for people who remember the Vietnam War, up through the Afghan National Security Forces. So that was a piece that it's basically a piece of writing from essentially 1919 that could get ripped out of a story about a drone strike today. But I found a home for that in this op-ed that's going to be coming out, I think maybe in a couple hours. But there's so many things. I mean, I wish I could have included that trip to the Frog Museum with Seeley. As anyone who's written a book, I don't know how many books I wrote that I had to cut out. Yeah. There are just so many incredible moments, and Butler is just he's this fascinating character. And there were some things that, I was able to, sort of work in like a little bit of, I have a scene, it's like kind of a partial scene where during Butler's anti-war phase, in 1935, he appears at an event in Cleveland, and it's sort of thrown. The event is kind of put on by like the Communist Party, but like they're not all communists who are involved in it, and it's a protest against war and against fascism, and it's Butler an important anti-fascist from Cleveland, Langston Hughes, all appear on this stage together along with other people. And there's other people who I'm like leaving out of this brief telling. And just like what, so, and there's a Marine spy who comes to this meeting and reports back to the commandant what's happening at this meeting. And he's there to sort of inform on Butler. But he writes all this stuff about Langston Hughes. And one of the things that he says is that this Hughes guy must be a communist spy because he speaks far too eloquently to have written these things on his own. So they must have been written for him by CPUSA. Clearly. And so, and then, I was able to sort of go down this rabbit hole and like figure out a little bit, there's some interaction between Butler and Langston Hughes, which obviously, it doesn't need to be said, but puts the lie to that particular insult. Anyway, so there were so many things. This book was 5 years in the making. I could write a whole series. Honestly, I don't think I will, but I could.
Well, I hope that there are more of these op-eds that are coming. I know the feeling of the cutting room floor and looking down at it and being like, damn, that's like 3 other books.
Yeah.
So I feel you on that. One of the things that I kept thinking about as I was reading, and this might be the last question, is like, what does it mean to live ethically as an American, given this history? Like, if we look around us, I was kind of making light of it earlier, but like our fruit, our clothes, our houses, the material that makes our cars, all this stuff, to varying degrees, are material manifestations of a history of violence and oppression and imperialism. Whether it's the things that the people who were killed, essentially killed to make the Panama Canal that so much of our stuff comes through, whether it's the bananas in Honduras, whether it's the beef in Mexico, whatever the case may be. What do you think about how do we live ethically given this history and the ways that all of us, even when we try, ostensibly benefit from the material resources that have been extracted as a result of this past?
Yeah, I mean, and it's all done, because we're an empire. It's all done with sort of a flick of the wrist. Another moment that I remember from this, just sort of coming back to me right now, that I remember from my travels that I couldn't include was at the fancier museum, El Museo del Canal, the Museum of the Panama Canal in Panama City. I had to get sort of a special escort in order to be able to take photos for my notes. And while I was going around this museum, the guy who's escorting me asks, so what do Americans think about the fact that the Panama Canal was given back to us in 1999? Are they still mad about it? And I was like, I don't know how to tell you this. Most Americans don't even know that we had it at this point. It's not because we wrung everything out of it. And at the cost of all these lives and all these things in Panama. And they're still, they are still very much living today in the canal, but with all these legacies of American imperialism. And I don't know, I don't think that the fact that I had that conversation with him makes me an inherently ethical person. I think it's a really, really hard question to answer. And honestly, I think it's a question that Smedley Butler was dealing with in his life. I mean, one of the reasons why he is such a fascinating character, that I've spent the last 7 years essentially living in my head with, is because at the end of his life, he recants his imperial past. He writes the series of he writes War is a Racket, and then he writes this series of articles in a socialist magazine where he says, I participated in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics. I made China safe for Standard Oil. I, made, Haiti and Cuba a good place for the Citibank boys. Citibank still exists, to collect revenues in. Looking back on it, I could have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he did was operate in 3 city districts. We Marines on 3 continents. And the ultimate tragedy of his life, and maybe this is the ultimate tragedy of our lives, is that he ultimately belatedly sees this imperfectly. He never really deals with his racism. He never really deals with his intersections of masculinity and white supremacy, but he does see to a far greater extent than almost any other Marine does at his time, or most any other person does, really. He sees the way in which these things that he did that brought him so much honor and fame and glory have, these destructive effects, not only on the rest of the world, but on ourselves here at home. On these ways in which, as Aimé Césaire says, one of the ultimate consequences of colonialism is the brutalization of the colonizer, which then comes back home in the form of fascism and brutality at home. Ultimately, Butler, he's a great success as an imperialist. He's really a failure at any kind of attempt at anti-war or anti-colonialism. He spends his last stores of energy trying to prevent World War II from happening and trying to prevent the United States from getting involved in it, and to convince Americans to decolonize our holdings, especially in the Pacific. And it's only with World War II that the Philippines, which 3 chapters of this book that Butler spends so much time in, that the Philippines are finally granted their belated independence after we have bombed them to death. To a certain extent for Douglas MacArthur's ego, so that he can make good on his promise. I shall return, and then return to Manila, which becomes the second worst destroyed city in the world after Warsaw in World War II. And Butler's trying to prevent that from happening, and he fails. And to a great extent, he has failed to do so because he was such an active participant in creating this empire and creating these imperial structures. And really, and I think this is the thing that you deal with in your work as well. Ultimately, this kind of individuals versus structures. How much of an impact can any one person have versus these larger historical and social structures? And the answer is it depends. It depends on where that individual is placed. An individual president can have much more influence than an unhoused person, who's just watching all these things go by. To a certain extent, it has to do with the ways, the extent to which we are participating in sort of the goals of these structures in making things worse. You can have much more effect then. If you are trying to make a war happen with Russia right now, you are going to be much more successful than if you try to fight against it, unless you're one of the people who might have influence on this, who can stop the war machine as it goes into overdrive. And so maybe the answer is that it is impossible to ultimately be truly ethical and still be inside. It's impossible to dismantle the house using the master's tools, right? Maybe that's the answer. It is, it is more ethical to try. It is more ethical to try to shine a light on these things and uplift the people who are trying to point out these crimes and to prevent further ones from happening. People like Azmat Khan, our New America colleague, who has done just incredible work. And I in the op-ed that I have, I'm tying sort of Butler and to her work actually. But at the same time, it's like my daughter needs bananas.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
And
hard to extricate yourself from it.
Yeah. So it's hard. It's really hard. And maybe the answer, I feel like this is the Jewish, like the Talmudic answer. It's like, it's the argument, it's the struggle, like it's being in the fight that like where it's as much as you can do. But it's also, looking at the ways in which looking at the ways in which you're perpetuating the empire and the ways in which you're trying to dismantle it and trying to make the best choices you can.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that so much of the point of educating yourself and struggling with it and reflecting on it, and books like yours that teach us so much about it, are so that we don't do the same thing in the future, right? And I think that is that makes the struggle, meaningful. So, Jonathan, man, it's an excellent book. Congratulations. I know virtual tours and virtual, the situation can be weird. I hope you get a chance to do some in-person stuff, at least a few sometime soon. But hope your daughter and your family are doing well. Hope she's loving those bananas as much as my kids are.
She does.
And thank you all. Thank you to everybody who joined us over your lunch break, or if you're on the West Coast, your breakfast break. Appreciate you coming through. Again, buy this book. You won't regret it. It's really, really excellent. And if you're into audiobooks, you can get the audiobook, whatever your thing is. Jonathan, thank you. New America, thank you. And I think they're going to close us out.